Our text today is taken from the book of Deuteronomy in the 8th chapter, the 2nd verse. Thou shalt remember all the way which Yahweh thy God hath led thee these 40 years in the desert, that he might humble thee and test thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or not. 40 years is a long time. And wandering for 40 years may seem like a harsh sentence. And the Israelites served this sentence in the desert, in the wilderness. The 40 years and the wilderness or the desert both represent spiritually the time and state of spiritual temptation. In the account of the temptations of Jesus, of which we read in our lesson from Luke, the setting was also the wilderness. And although the 40 comes in terms of days rather than years, the connection between the two stories is obvious. The account in Luke even recalls the story in Deuteronomy, quoting the words, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every saying of God." The temptations of Jesus proceed in a fashion one might expect in a story of spiritual testing. The devil proposes a course of action, and Jesus resists, in each case actually answering with a passage from Scripture. But if the wandering of the Israelites in the wilderness of Sinai portrays a time of temptation, it is hard to see how it fits the same pattern. What were they tempted to do? Or to fail to do? It seems more like a period of feeling deserted, aimless, without direction. And similarly, another period of 40 days, also representing temptation, the flood of Noah. Although it represents a time of spiritual trial, it again doesn't seem to fit the pattern of temptation, at least as people often picture it. Noah faced challenging circumstances, but it does not seem to be a case of wanting to do something wrong and then resisting. There's no indication that Noah didn't willingly do what the Lord commanded him to do without hesitation. What challenges do we face that correspond to those of Noah? How can they be called temptations? Since we are all likely to go through periods of spiritual testing or temptation, it behooves us to be clear about what it actually is. And we can perhaps gain some clarity by looking closely at the narrative of the 40 years in the wilderness, which is one of the most prominent stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. Not only is it the setting for most of the 5 books of Moses, it is even in the Hebrew name for one of those books. The fourth of those books, the name we use for the fourth of those books, we get from the Greek, the book of Numbers, the Greek being arithmoi. But in Hebrew, it is actually Bamidbar. And that means in the wilderness. The fourth book is called In the Wilderness. And the prophets, the Psalms, and the later histories all hark back to the lessons that were learned at this time and in these desert places. So let us think about the lessons that may be here for us. What is it for us to experience this state of wilderness? But to do this, let us go back and sketch out how the Israelites had gotten to this point. For several hundred years, they had been in Egypt, first as honored guests, but at length as slaves. The Lord then liberated them from that bondage with signs and wonders, a series of 11 plagues, and a great culminating miracle in which they were led through the Red Sea while Pharaoh's army was destroyed. The Lord then led them to Mount Sinai, where, amidst thunder and lightning, smoke and flame, the 10 Commandments were delivered through Moses. Soon after this, the Israelites were encamped in the wilderness near the southern boundaries of Canaan. They had left Egypt a vast multitude with no particular order to it, but now by the Lord's command, they had been counted, and they had been set in order, both for their encampment around the tabernacle and for their journeyings. They had thus been prepared by the Lord to take up their inheritance in the promised land. The Lord now told them that they should send 12 spies into the land and make ready to conquer it. The spies searched out the land for 40 days. They returned bringing samples of the lush produce of the land. They brought pomegranates and figs. They carried on a staff between two of them an immense cluster of grapes. Truly, they reported, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. But their report did not end there. Despite the wonders of this new land, 10 of the spies felt they should not try to take it. The people are powerful, they warned. The cities are strongly fortified. And compared with the giants who inhabit that land, we were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, they protested. 2 of the spies tried to stem the tide of fear and cowardice that ran through all the people, trying to encourage them with the Lord, that with the Lord's help they could cast out these mighty inhabitants of the land of Canaan. But it was to no avail. The heart of the people failed them. They would not go up against the land. As pictured in the story, the wrath of God then turned upon the disobedient people. A plague smote the 10 spies. The rest of the people, God warned, from 20 years old and upward would perish during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and only Joshua and Caleb would be spared. Reflecting on this sequence, we may wonder how the children of Israel failed to accept the Lord's encouragement to conquer the land of Canaan. The Exodus, the dramatic events at Mount Sinai, these were not dim memories in the minds of the Israelites. They had only recently heard the Lord's commandments come from Mount Sinai. Why did their trust in the Lord's guidance and protection falter? Why did they pay no heed to the words of Joshua and Caleb, who recommended going ahead and taking the land? Hadn't they seen the Lord lead them out of Egypt with a mighty hand? Hadn't they witnessed miracles in the wilderness and drama on Mount Sinai? How could they doubt the power of the Lord to accomplish all the things that he had promised? We can be puzzled at this behavior of the Israelites, but it may be more understandable when we consider our own weaknesses and vacillations. Even if we know well the stories of the Lord's power as demonstrated in the Word, and even despite previous occasions in our own lives when we may have witnessed the Lord guiding us in ways we could never have imagined beforehand. Nevertheless, we too fail to trust that the Lord will bear us up if we follow his bidding in the face of seemingly impossible odds. So what is the moral of the story? What should it mean to us? Is it just another in a long string of examples of how hard it is to trust the Lord's power and how dire are the consequences of disobeying his will? To gain some perspective on this, let us consider this question. How free were the children of Israel to obey the Lord and go up against the land? At first, that may seem like a strange question. Without doubt, the Lord had showed him his mighty hand, and beyond question were the laws he had given for their guidance. The Lord had, as we have seen, ordered them and arranged them so that they could be an effective fighting force. Was not all the weight on the side of going straightway up to take the land? Well, to see that there is a legitimate question here, let us look at the parallels of this story of the Israelites with the spiritual journey of our own lives. We spend all our childhood in Egypt, so to speak. We abide in the land of knowledge and drink into our minds much of what is there. But as yet, we are only slaves. We do not think for ourselves. We serve other people's ideas of what is right and how we should live. And this, of course, is a necessary stage, but one that needs to be left behind. When the Lord leads us out of the house of bondage, we have the opportunity to hear his voice for ourselves. We study the Word, we perceive the Lord's commandments in the way that the Israelites heard the voice of God from Sinai. We reflect on and reason about what we learn from the Word. If we open ourselves to the Lord's guidance, he will begin to order our minds as he ordered the camp of the Israelites into the form of heaven. Our spirits will become, as the encampment of Israel, organized to serve the Lord and fight off spiritual foes. So, at the point we begin our adult lives, we have already, or many of us have, in a certain sense, all that we need to enter the promised land of heaven. We have sufficient knowledge to begin the life that leads to heaven. Why then do people still need to undergo a lifelong process of spiritual change to get there? Why didn't the Israelites, who had been prepared by the Lord, take the land of Canaan when they were still fresh out of Egypt? The Israelites did at length conquer the land of Canaan. What was different then? What had they at that point that they had not had before? Was the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. In the literal story, it sounds as though the 40 years of wandering were simply a punishment from a vindictive God. But we know, of course, that God does not behave in this fashion. Everything the Lord does or permits is done to help us and to further our spiritual growth. We can shake our heads with regret that the Israelites did not obey the Lord and go up against the land of Canaan right after they first spied it out. And we can regret that we ourselves have not followed the Lord right away as soon as we know where he would lead us. But the fact is that we cannot be regenerated without temptation. All conjunction of good and truth takes place through temptation. The Israelites had all the truth that they needed to go ahead and take the land. They had seen the Lord's power. They knew what he could do, but this was simply a matter of intellect. What we know and what we feel can be two different things. We could all admit that the Lord's way is the only way, but we are not convinced of this with every fiber of our being, at least as we begin our spiritual journey. This takes the joining together of what we know with what we feel, the conjunction of truth and good. And this, the doctrines tell us, happens only through a series of tests and trials. Even if temptation is often attended with the sense that we, from our own power, have failed, this does not mean we should not try. It is crucial to cultivate the youthful idealism represented by Joshua and Caleb, which will not only urge us onward at the beginning, but will also survive to lead us to the successes that follow when, after 40 years, all the weaknesses and doubts have died off. 40 years it took the Israelites to become prepared to face the challenges of Canaan. And it is a literal 40 years, or even more, that it will take most of us to learn life's lessons to the point that they are really fully and completely ready to follow the Lord. But what are these lessons? The question of the real nature of temptation has not yet really been addressed head on. What do battles and floods and times of desolate wandering have in common? Temptations are characterized in the doctrines as an assault upon a love. It's easy to see how this is pictured in a war. The good side is wholesome love, an ideal, And the bad side is the enticement or the inclination in opposition to this love. We have this mental battleground in us for this kind of temptation. But what about a flood? In this case, our loves and hopes are inundated with cares and concerns, and we can feel overwhelmed and hopeless. It's not an attraction to some evil, it's simply a failure to trust the Lord. And likewise, wandering in the wilderness. Now, although we have our dreams, our goals, and our ideals, we nevertheless can feel lost as to how to pursue those goals, how to achieve these things we dream about. In the various scenarios, the causes of our anxiety or spiritual grief are different. But what they have in common is the one only solution: trust in the Lord's power. 40 years in the wilderness is often spoken of as years of wandering. But, of course, these years were not wasted, and they were not truly wandering. Note the actual words of the text. It does not say, remember how you wandered for 40 years. It says, remember how God has led you. The Lord did not forget the Israelites for 40 years. He provided manna daily for their sustenance. He led them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He brought them victory over enemies they faced during this time. They had entered the wilderness, an untested army. They left it as a well-organized battle array. In our years of seeming wandering, we too are led by the Lord at every turn. Each experience, whether it seems positive or negative, can be an opportunity to practice trusting in the Lord and not in ourselves. We realize that the feeling of failure is normal and often necessary part of the process. Does this let us off the hook? Even if the Lord does not hold us responsible in the long run, we will still, here in the world of time and space, have to suffer consequences, pain, and hardship, sometimes for failures beyond our strength to avoid. We must learn to use such occasions to make firm our resolve to try harder in the future and to receive with gratitude the grace that the Lord grants us in keeping us from the things that we would shun. We can also try to learn to exercise patience with ourselves and with others. It's a long process. If we let the wilderness years be years of ever-increasing trust in the Lord and conviction about His power to save us, we too will find that when our time has come full term, we are ready to follow the Lord into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. Amen.